My name is Chiara Moore. I am super excited to be here today to talk to you all about a topic that might spark a range of emotions in this room. RFPs. So whether that sparked a feeling of happiness or more likely a feeling of sinking dread, that is okay. My goal is that by the end of this, you will feel more confident in how to run a successful RFP and maybe even a little excited about what the right RFP could do for you and your team. And before we get into the process that we use, let's make sure we're all on the same page. I'm sure everyone here already knows this, but RFP stands for Request for Proposal. And it's essentially a way to compare different options objectively and understand the strengths and the weaknesses of each tool. It can also be a really good negotiation tactic. It can help you negotiate better deals when you have multiple proposals in hand and you understand why someone might choose one tool over another. RFPs can be a lot of work. Anyone who's run one of those knows this. So you have to keep in mind when it might be worth that work of running one. And there are a few criteria that pretty much guarantee that it's a good idea to run an RFP. The first criteria is if it is a primary tech at your company. I think safe to say everyone here is very familiar with the ATS. That's a really good example of this. That's the backbone of your recruiting team, and really critical hiring is happening in there every single day. Another criteria is if it's a longer term investment. So if you don't want to have to go through this whole process again in a year, you're going to want to make sure that you're picking the right tool. And the third is if it's cross-functional tech. So if multiple teams in the company are going to be in and out of that tool every single day, it can create really, really big headaches that radiate across the company if you do not make the right choice. So let's say that your tool meets those criteria. What's next? Before we go into exactly how to run an RFP, we're going to talk about what an RFP is not. Unfortunately, some of these steps might feel familiar to some of you. How not to RFP all starts with the CEO handshake, which is when your CEO gets lunch with another CEO, they really hit it off, and by the end of lunch, surprise, your team has purchased a new piece of tech that has promised to solve all of your problems. The issue there is that it's very quickly usually followed up with the phantom functionality, which is when that tool gets thrown over the fence to the team that's actually responsible for implementing and using it, but it never went through any real vetting, so that functionality that sounded so great over lunch doesn't actually come to life in the way that you expected. And then it all comes full circle with the ghost town, which is when a few weeks after that tool launches, excitement totally fizzles and usage in the tool plummets because that tool doesn't actually solve the problem that it set out to in the first place. And in the worst case scenario, that can mean that you are stuck in a long, expensive contract with no ROI. So if even one of those steps felt familiar to you, you will understand why we wanted to do things a little bit differently at Confluent. And it took a lot of hard work and a lot of collaboration, but I think we pulled it off. During our last RFP process, we had 93% of our team participate in selecting that new technology. We are about 3/4 of the way through our implementation with 0 implementation surprises. Everyone please knock on wood for me, thank you. And we have built very strong relationships internally within our recruiting team, with our stakeholders that we partner with at our company, and also with the vendor that we selected. And speaking of strong vendor relationships, it will probably come to no surprise to any of you that we used this process to purchase a new ATS, which was Ashby. But I promise you did not just sign up for a 10-minute Ashby pitch. This is something you can use for any type of tool. It does not need to be an ATS, doesn't need to be Ashby. The process that we followed to select our tech fell broadly into 4 stages. Started with research, then went into evaluation, then testing, and then selection. And you'll see that we really intentionally baked our stakeholder participation into every step of the process. And when I talk about stakeholders, I don't just mean the usual suspects of recruiters and sourcers and coordinators. I also mean the people that we partner with outside of recruiting. So that can be obviously your hiring managers and your interviewers, but also finance, HRIS, people ops. And we started with a very long list of potential ATS vendors, and in order to narrow that down, we took a holistic approach. We started by talking to all of those internal stakeholders and understanding what systems they'd used in the past, what they loved about those, what they'd hated, and what they felt like they really needed out of this next system to move the needle for them and make that cost of change worth it. We also talked to a lot of teams at companies that were at similar sizes and stages as us to understand their pain points, their best practices, and what tech was top of mind for them right now. And then finally, to close things out, we looked at G2 reviews online to get a sense for the broader user sentiment around each tech. And that helped us get into the 5 tools that we wanted to really get into the details with. And then it was time to think about our requirements. So in order to workshop our requirements, we ran focus groups with each one of those types of stakeholders because we wanted to make sure that our requirements were both specific and comprehensive enough to capture what they actually needed out of the tool. And the end product of running this process was a spreadsheet of 200 requirements that fell into 15 different categories of what we were looking for. And when we had our requirement document finalized, we sent it over to the vendors and they sent back their responses to us. And those written responses allowed us to get an initial round of scoring for each tech, which was really helpful because it gave us a sense for kind of an initial view of where tools were stronger or where they were weaker. But then this is where we kind of started to deviate from what might be considered a standard normal RFP process because we actually took the time to validate each and every response to the requirement that each vendor sent us. And we did this in 2 different ways. So where it was possible, we looked at their knowledge base, their documentation online, and we actually read through how it would come to life in their tool, in their documentation. And where we weren't able to do that, we held live targeted demos with each vendor to have them actually click through every single step. And between that initial round of scoring based on the responses that they gave us and the finalized scoring once we'd validated what they could actually do, the scores changed a ton. And there were a few reasons for that. So one of the things that we were really solving for throughout this process was efficiency. We knew that if a tool was going to slow down our recruiters, that wasn't the right tool for us. And we found there were a lot of cases where maybe a vendor could technically meet the requirement, but it took way too many clicks to get there. There were also cases where they said they could meet the requirement, but it was going to take a third-party integration to get there. It would take external development work and hours to get there. Or what they were showing us was actually an add-on tool that maybe wasn't something we had initially been considering as part of what we were looking for. So this part of the process was very clarifying for us. And if this all sounds like a ton of work, the focus groups and the evaluation matrix and going through all of that validation, it is a ton of work. It's probably just as much work as it sounds like, maybe more. It took our team weeks. But this is where it will really pay off for you to go big. You can think about it as either paying that time up front to really get your requirements right and make your RFP successful, or getting down the line in implementation and realizing that it doesn't actually work the way that you thought it was going to. That's a little more painful. And the end result of this evaluation process was essentially a heat map where we could see which tools were stronger and which were weaker and in what categories. And we had a very clear score for those tools, and it was super obvious to us which tools we wanted to advance to that finalist stage. So we had our top 2 vendors that we wanted to look at, and it was time for us to take things for a test drive in both systems. So we ran a sandboxing process. We involved over 100 members of the Confluent team, where we took these sandbox environments and we created prescribed testing scripts for people to click through. Obviously, these were not fully configured or customized environments, so we had to keep things really structured and really simple and think about the 1 to 2 key workflows that user type would go through in that tech on a day-to-day basis. And we had them go through that script, and they would rate each workflow they went through and tell us how intuitive it was and give us comment feedback on why they rated it the way that they did. And this was so helpful for us to compare those tools objectively collectively. And then at the end of the process, when they had gone through that with both systems, they were able to vote for their preferred tool. So we had this score of which tool our team preferred, but we also understood exactly why our team preferred it. By the time that we chose Ashby as our ATS, we were extremely confident in that decision. And not only that, but our team was completely bought in and really excited to kick off our implementation. Our team had been through a number of RFP processes at that point collectively, and so as we were going through, we had a few traps that we knew were really easy to fall into during the RFP process that we actively worked to avoid. So if you and your team are thinking about running an RFP, I highly recommend that you keep these in mind. The first is just ignoring the PR of it all. I think we can all be honest with ourselves that we tend to resist change that we did not get to weigh in on, whether or not that change is for the better, even if it's for the better. And so part of what we did very intentionally here was making our stakeholders owners and advocates during that process. We really wanted them to feel that it was something they were driving, not something that was happening to them from talent ops. And part of making them owners, drivers of that meant that we held them accountable for being informed decision makers. And that's why we required that they go through that sandboxing testing process so that their vote was based on hands-on experience in the tool. It wasn't just what they were more familiar with or what they'd heard from their friend was good. And then finally, taking things at face value. So this really became clear to us during the process of validating all of those scores. We realized that a yes/no answer was not going to be thorough enough vetting for us. And as an example of this, if you say that you want a tool that gives you smart scheduling, there are going to be dozens of tools on the market that tell you that they can do that. But anyone here who's been responsible for scheduling an interview panel knows that there is a ton of complexity, a ton of granularity underneath that requirement. So do yourself and your team a favor and vet those requirements very thoroughly. You do not want to get to the end of this process and find out that the functionality that your team was most excited about doesn't really exist or comes with a much heftier price tag than you originally realized. So this stayed pretty high level because I only had 10 minutes, but like I said, we've been through a few of these now, and this time it really went drastically differently in a very good way. So if you are about to run an RFP and you want more details on how we did this, or you would like to see templates, please find me later today. I would love to talk to you more about this, or come find me on LinkedIn. Thank you all so much.